Okay, grade 10s, we're going to take a look at making ions and how do we go from an atom to an ion. An atom that gains or loses electrons is called an ion. So when we lose electrons, we're losing negatives. And because you're getting rid of your negatives, you're positively charged. However, if you're gaining electrons, we're adding negatives on, you become negatively charged. You got to remember, because electrons are negative things, so the more you put on, the more negative you get. The more you remove, the more positive you get. And they're always going to gain and lose electrons until we get to having a charge or an outer shell that looks like a noble gas, a full shell of electrons. Now, when we lose electrons, we call these cations. Cations is what we use to call a positively charged ion. I always remember it because I think of cat with a big plus sign. Cation have the positive charge. Typically, metals lose their electrons and form cations. So, for example, take a look at sodium. As an atom, sodium has 11 protons in its nucleus and 11 electrons in its rings, 2 in the first ring, 8 in the second, and 1 in the third. Because my valence ring, my outermost ring, has only 1 electron, it will lose it. It's the easiest thing to do. So that electron will come off and go flying away. And now sodium only has 10 electrons in its outermost shell. This shell is now empty. So 11 positives and 10 negatives gives me a charge of +1. Sodium gets a plus charge. Negative ions are called anions, and negative ions happen when we gain electrons. Usually, nonmetals tend to gain electrons. So chlorine, for example, gains 1 electron and gets a charge of -1. When we have negative ions, we change their name to sound like ide, I-D-E. So chlorine becomes chloride, and oxygen becomes oxide. Oxygen gains 2 electrons. Take a look at chlorine. Chlorine has 17 positives, 17 protons in the middle, and 17 electrons in the ring. The outermost ring, the valence ring, has 7 electrons. It's in group 7 on the periodic table. The easiest way to get a full outer shell this time is to add an electron. Because chlorine now has 18 electrons, we've gained 1, its charge is -1. And its name is now called chloride. Noble gases, anything in group 8, typically will not form an ion. They already have a completed outer shell and have no need to form an ion. We can typically figure out what the charge on an atom is going to be just from its position on the periodic table. Remember, we named our families, or we numbered them from 1 through 8. So 1, 2, skip a few, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These numbers, my family numbers, tells us the number of valence electrons that the atom will have. Any atom from families 1 to 4 more commonly tends to lose electrons. They will lose as many electrons as they have in their valence ring. So, anybody in group 1 loses 1 valence electron and gets a charge of +1. Everyone in group 2 loses 2 and gets a charge of +2. We're going to skip the transition elements in the middle for now. In group 3, they have 3 electrons, and they tend to have a charge of +3 when they lose them. The elements in group 4 can sometimes gain and sometimes lose electrons, but more commonly they'll form the plus charge than the minus, although both are possible. When we take a look at the elements that fall in groups 5, 6, and 7, these ones more commonly tend to gain electrons. And they're going to gain as many electrons as they need to get to that magic number of 8 in their valence ring. Because everybody in group 5 already has 5, they will gain 3. And when you add 3 negatives, you get a charge of -3. Those found in group 6 tend to gain 2 more, and that whole family gets a charge of -2. And the ones in group 7 will gain 1 and get a charge of -1. Remember, again, those found in group 8 get a charge of 0. They will not form ions. Atoms will gain and lose electrons to each other. When atoms collide, the valence electrons interact. And that's actually what happens when we make a chemical bond. Sometimes atoms will give away their electrons. That's what metals tend to do. And nonmetals tend to like to take those electrons. At that point, they're oppositely charged and tend to stick together. Before we start learning how atoms combine to form compounds, we're going to practice making ions and figuring out their charges. It's the important first step. Take a look at a couple of examples that I'll do with you. We know that sodium's in group 1 on the periodic table and forms a charge of +1. Because it's in group 1, it has 1 valence electron. When I draw sodium, I draw it with only 1 dot for 1 electron. In order to empty that outer shell, like all metals, it will lose 1 electron, and because it's lost a negative, its charge is positive by 1. We would write as an ion sodium +1. We would write the number +1 in this upper right-hand corner, which is the space reserved for charge. Let's take a look at beryllium. On your periodic table, we see beryllium is in group number 2 on your periodic table. That means it has 2 valence electrons. So there are 2 valence electrons in beryllium. To draw beryllium, I would need 2 dots, 1 for each of the valence electrons. It is a metal, and all metals will lose electrons. We have 2 to lose, so it will lose 2 of them. Because we've lost electrons, our charge becomes positive. Beryllium will get a charge of +2, 1 for each electron that it loses. Finally, let's look at chlorine. Chlorine is found here in group number 7 on the periodic table. All elements in group 7 have 7 valence electrons. So chlorine has 7 valence electrons. To draw chlorine, I will need 7 dots. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now we start to double them. 5, 6, 7. These are my 7 valence electrons. It is less work for chlorine just to add 1 more. Nonmetals tend to gain electrons. I only need to gain 1 more electron to fill my outer shell. Because I've gained 1 electron, chlorine will now have a charge of -1. Nonmetals get negative charges and are called anions. You guys can finish the rest of this chart as a practice in making ions, and then we'll start seeing how ions get together to form compounds in the next lesson.